Welcome to Starter TV. I'm Jennifer Crumpton, and today I'm talking with Pankaj Ghemawat. He's the author of World 3.0, Global Prosperity and How to Achieve It, and he's a global professor of management at NYU's Stern School of Business, as well as IESE in Barcelona. Thank you so much for being here with us today from across the ocean. I'm really interested in what role mentors have played in developing this successful career, and who have been some of your mentors.
Yeah, I think that if you're born in a small town in India, to get far in life, you really need a family environment that supports, encourages learning. My father's a university professor. My mother was the first woman in her very traditional family to go to college. And so I think it really started with our parents pushing us to excel academically, because with different parents, things would have turned out very, very differently. And then, of course, beyond that, my teachers, and there have been many teachers because I've had many years of formal education. So I can think of my Sanskrit teacher in medium school, who was particularly instrumental in sensitizing me to the humanities, which we had very little exposure to in India otherwise. But probably the teachers who had the biggest impact on me were my three thesis advisors at Harvard: Richard Caves, Michael Porter, Michael Spence, who are all very well known in the business world. And I could not imagine what life would have been like if I hadn't had this all-star cast of thesis advisors to provide not just direct, almost immediate feedback, but really enormous levels of inspiration.
How are you globalizing management education? And why is this such a critical thing?
Well, globalization of management education seems to be critical because if you look at large companies, they tend to be relatively globalized. If you look at small companies, most of them have aspirations to become more global. And yet, if you look at what the business schools actually do to train people to work in these companies, I'm not the only person who thinks that they actually do very little to teach people how to manage outside their native countries. So in fact, we're currently engaged in a joint project with Sam Palmisano, used to be the chairman of IBM. Sam's very worked up about this issue, and so we've joined forces and are actually working on a global scholars platform, a program to help disseminate some of this content. So I regard the critical challenge here as trying to figure out how we do more to globalize management education than the two most frequently employed devices, which is get a lot of interesting people together and then take them to some interesting places. And that is useful, but if that's all we do, we're just a specialized branch of the travel and hospitality sector. And there has to be some classroom content, something specifiable in the curriculum that helps undergird and inform these trips abroad, the study away periods, etc. And unfortunately, most business schools, especially in the US, do not have anything like required material on globalization at the micro level in their curricula.
Wow. So you've developed a type of curriculum that they can use in the classroom as well as abroad.
Yeah, I've been involved in trying to develop materials for this for some time now. I was originally involved in a task force that the AACSB set up on the globalization of management education. AACSB is the biggest accreditation body for business schools. And so it was a committee of 13 people, 12 deans and me, and since I had more spare time than most of the deans, the chair, Bob Bruner, who's the dean at Darden, and I basically, were the ones who did a fair amount of the drafting, along with the help of the AACSB. And I was quite sort of struck by the fact that a very disparate group of business school deans were all willing to endorse the chapter I wrote under my own name on the very small topic of what business schools should teach students about globalization and how.
Wow.
So the AACSB report led to the development of some materials, a course on a disc that the AACSB has been distributing to all its accredited institutions, a suggestion from the AACSB, although it's not yet at least an accreditation requirement, that schools consider offering something like this, if not exactly this type of course. And then, since inertia tends to be high in the academic sector as well as many other sectors, I've been involved in some discussions with them again recently about how we try and take this to the next level by trying to develop some digitized material that would be more like a 1-2 day seminar teaching the teachers how to teach globalization.
I guess that's important too.
Well, given the dearth of qualified people to teach globalization, and this country is actually much more fortunate in this respect than the parts of the world where there's been a lot of growth in business schools recently. So if you look at countries like China or India, the last time I looked, India was supposed to have 3,000 business schools. There are definitely not 3,000 people in India qualified to teach globalization of business to all those students, and yet they need to learn something about this stuff. So I think part of it is we're trying to sort of, induce schools that do have their own faculty resources to at least consider adding some of this material to what they currently do. But I think in emerging economies like India, Mexico, Philippines, and China, to name 4 of the biggest concentrations of business schools in the world outside the advanced economies, clearly there's a sort of even more important role for trying to use technology to substitute for some of the deficiencies that are going to take decades to overcome in terms of training people to teach this stuff and actually getting them down the learning curve to the point where they can develop their own materials entirely along the lines that they consider appropriate. What we try and do is provide a little bit of a framework that can be customized to the needs of different regions. And so the idea is we can provide a bit of a conceptual structure, some general purpose teaching materials, but I suspect that what you want to teach students about globalization in India is a little bit different from what you want to teach students in the United States about globalization. And so right now what we have is a customizable framework for thinking about how you design such a course.
What do you think is the biggest skills gap we're facing in the U.S., and what should we be doing about that?
Well, clearly, education, equality of opportunity, much on people's minds. I think when I think of the skills gaps in the U.S., I sort of parse it according to the vowels in the English, in the Roman alphabet, A, E, I, O, U. And each of those captures a facet of what I think needs to happen. Okay. The A stands for apprenticeship. I think that there's an emerging consensus that one of the respects in which the U.S. lags, for instance, countries like Germany, is in the absence of programs that really do add significant skills at a vocational level, and so are a bit of a departure from the traditional high school, college, etc. sequence, with many people not going from high school to college. The hope is that, at least for some of those people, apprenticeships are going to make sense and are going to help them be much better prepared for integration with the workforce. And there's some truly striking statistics on the value of apprenticeship. I think there was a recent study that concluded something like a $250,000 lifetime gain for an apprentice, and a social return on these kinds of investments of the order of 30 or 40%. Wow. If I remember the numbers correctly. So apprenticeship is one obvious area where there needs to be improvement. Second, E in AEIOU stands for early education in my mind, because we have this paradox of the U.S. clearly dominates the world in terms of leading universities. And yet when we look at primary and middle school education in particular, or when we look at the PISA tests and see where the U.S. ranks, there is clearly the U.S. is well behind many other advanced countries or countries that until recently were considered emerging, like South Korea. And it's a little bit hard to imagine some of the broader social issues that have triggered this debate about a skills gap being resolved if we're leaving so many people behind.
Right.
The people who are never going to benefit from expensive and high quality university educations and who are stuck with the worst aspects in a comparative sense of the American educational system.
From the very beginning.
From the very beginning.
Yeah.
So that strikes me as another important priority. The I in this vowel sequence is immigration, and while immigration is a contentious topic, not just in this country, I spend half my time in Europe, and it's at least as contentious in Europe as it is in the United States. The point is that, at least a number of countries have adopted points-based immigration systems as a way of addressing specific gaps that they have in terms of skills. And, these are countries that generally are pretty thoughtful about what they do. Singapore comes to mind. I think the Canadians have such a system. And it clearly would make sense for the U.S., something that's even acknowledged by people who are generally very hostile to immigration into the U.S., to have, for instance, more of the foreign students who come and attend great American universities, to make it easier rather than harder for them to stay on in this country.
Right.
So I think that immigration, unlike early education, which is a grassroots, will take a while to sort of actually affect, given some of the constraints that surround the educational system in this country, the unions, et cetera. I think immigration is something that clearly, in terms of skilled immigration, I think that there is significantly less political resistance and it's a much more feasible alternative. The O in the vowel sequence stands for optimism. And I think it's important to remember that while there are these issues around lack of apprenticeships, weaknesses in early education, hard to explain elements of the immigration system, that the U.S. is actually operating at a 5.5% unemployment rate, is growing significantly more robustly than West Europe. And I make this point about optimism because when I talk to young people today, for instance, my daughter, who's a junior at Wellesley College, she and her friends seem way more concerned about how employable they're going to be and what they're going to find when they get out there than we ever were when I was an undergraduate at a liberal arts college, also in Boston, Massachusetts, where we frankly didn't spend much time back in the 1970s thinking about these issues. Right. So on the one hand, as a parent, I feel I'm glad that my daughter is thinking ahead to what she wants to do with her life. I do worry a little bit that, to the extent that extreme pessimism settles in, some of the best elements of a liberal arts education, again, another distinctive thing of the U.S. educational system, are going to get watered down in, crazy frenzy of pre-professionalism. And so I think, the basic model, get a broad education, focus on something deep, but have a broad enough base that you're able to execute some changes in the course of your career, is probably the model I'd recommend, but it's a model that seems very risky to people who are really very worried about what the job prospects look like. So one can overdo the gloom and doom in a way that induces young people to make the wrong choices, at least in my opinion. And finally, the U in AEIOU is universality, and again, this goes back to the big debate about social inequality, et cetera. And without insisting on equality of outcomes, in terms of equality of opportunities, I think it should be fairly non-controversial that there are significant groups that have been systematically left behind for various historical reasons, and that focusing or concentrating some efforts there is going to yield more in the level of aggregate social benefits than distributing the same amount of financial support, et cetera, very evenly but thinly across the entire population. So when I think of the enormous gains that occurred when women joined the workforce in greater numbers, that to me is the best testament to sort of the unlocked potential of the groups. And I think this unfortunately still affects women to a significant extent, but there are also clearly ethnic minorities that are not on this alleged escalator of social progress.
What do you envision for the future of American education?
So let me talk about something that I haven't gotten into yet, which is that even though the universities are excellent, and that is the brightest spot in the U.S. educational system in comparative perspective, there is inevitably rising concern about the costs of college education. And there are, on the one hand, I'm an academic, so I kind of understand where some of this money goes and why it's not all just people taking long vacations or being mollycoddled, et cetera. But that said, very few industries in general manage to increase their prices faster than the rate of inflation without suffering some long-term consequences. And unfortunately, you know, education and, you know, I guess the healthcare sector and, you know, smaller sectors like funeral services come to mind as the only industries that have seen this kind of behavior. So there's a crisis of affordability in U.S. higher education. It's something that with all the questions now around student debt, with all the shenanigans that some of the for-profit universities practiced in terms of relying on loans from the government to send students through programs that were never really going to help their employability. It's an issue that I think is front and center on the minds of not just people who look at the educational sector from outside, but university presidents around this country. And I think I have an article coming out in the California Management Review, and a special issue on education, where the other people are such worthies as the president of Stanford, the ex-president of Yale, et cetera. My own pitch in this is that if we take the cost issues seriously, we cannot afford to assume that willingness to pay or ability to pay is going to continue to rise at these rates. So we really do need to think more effectively about how we use technology to curtail some of these costs. And so one of the things that I personally tried to do to sort of figure out what the possibilities are is I just actually started offering a MOOC, one of these massive open online courses on the Coursera platform, to try and figure out, okay, are MOOCs the answer? My own experience suggests that they're not, but my own experience suggests that the challenge of incorporating technology into what we do in universities is very critical. And to simply say that MOOCs are not up to the job misses out on the many mixing and matching opportunities that exist in terms of the flipped classroom, in terms of reserving classroom time, which is truly a scarce commodity, for stuff that really is best done face-to-face, but having the kind of transmission of lectures, et cetera, largely being technology-enabled as a way of freeing up time for what's really important to get together to talk about, while also trying to help contain some of the costs and ideally also improving the effectiveness of the educational experience. So I've taught most of my life at schools that favor the case method. That's always a highly interactive experience, and the hope is that the students learn quite a bit from that active engagement. I'm also struck by how many business schools still rely basically on pure lecture methods. Everything we know about learning suggests that passive learning is not nearly as effective as active learning, and technology can be used much more effectively to engage students. So it's not just a cost issue, it's also the benefits delivered to the students and to society ultimately through technology that I think is probably the biggest issue facing U.S. higher education, given the cost escalation.
In your book, World 3.0, you say that the world is not as globalized as we tend to think that it is. Why is that, and why is this important to know?
This conclusion of what I neutrally refer to as globalony, this tendency to overstate how globalized the world is, this was a bit of a surprise to me when I encountered it. What actually happened was I'm a big believer in using simple data rather than pure assertion to try and advance the discussion. So I started collecting some data on how globalized various activities that could either take place within or across national borders actually were. So things like, for instance, telephone calls. So what percentage of all the telephone calling minutes in the world last year would you say were accounted for by international phone calls? Say, plain old telephone service and Skype. Turns out the answer is, if you just look at plain old telephone service, it's about 2%. If you look at Skype, it brings the total up impressively to about 4.5%.
Really, that's it.
And yet, when I present these data to students, executives, huge disbelief. What are your sources, et cetera? So that got me thinking, if they don't believe the data, what do they believe? Then I started, and this is what I generally do to start my courses out with. I have students guess values which they probably have no prior exposure to, just as a way of sort of pointing out to them that their intuitions are somewhat mismatched with reality. So on the phone call question, I often get answers 30, 40, sometimes as high as 60%. I'm an economist, I'm used to error terms, but when I see an error of 1,000%, that's the sort of thing that would give even an economist pause in terms of what's going on. And so why it matters is, well, first of all, it's a good way of unfreezing people's intuitions that they know everything about globalization. If you can sort of start them, Kurt Lewin's old, unfreeze, change, and then refreeze aphorism about how you change how people think. So it's a great way of getting past this shell that people wear around themselves because everybody thinks that they encounter so much globalization in their lives that they just sort of understand it intuitively.
Right.
No need to look at the data, no need to sort of, really read any of the analyses. The reason why it matters per se is from the MOOC that I offered on Coursera, we actually have a large database and have been running some analyses. So it turns out that people are much more prone to believe various statements about globalization being bad if they have overestimates of how globalized the world is. And similarly, they're much more inclined to agree with dubious propositions about global strategy if they have inflated assumptions about how globalized the world is. So an example of each of those, on the public policy side, think of immigration. Basically, in all advanced countries, if you ask people what percentage of the population is first generation, born elsewhere, moved to the US, first generation immigrants, you typically get answers that are 2 to 4 times the actual levels.
Really?
And it's hard to see how this is helpful as opposed to hurtful to having a reasoned debate about immigration. So in Europe, for the 6 major European countries, the German Marshall Fund did a study recently. Average immigrant percentages in these countries, 8%. Average guesses, 24%. This obviously contributes to a sense of there is this tsunami that's threatening to wreck everything we hold near and dear. We got to stop it before it stops us. So you get people much more concerned about a set of public policy issues than if they had somewhat more calibrated and generally lower assessments of how much stuff is sloshing across borders in the first place. On the business side, what our data suggests is that if you have inflated intuitions about how globalized the world is, you're also much more likely to agree with such, at least within the field of international business, what are treated as highly dubious propositions like globalization means competing exactly the same way everywhere around the world. This hurts profits because countries still are quite separated as these low levels of cross-border flows indicate. It also creates social ill will because this is how you get these strategies of bigger and blander. which lead people to worry, are the multinationals displacing our culture?
Right.
Is the world going to look like, is all food eventually going to be fast food served by 3 probably US fast food chains, et cetera? And so both from a profit-making perspective and from a diplomacy public relations perspective, it would be good for businesses not to think that the best form of competing globally is to do exactly the same thing everywhere. And what our data suggests is that people who have overestimates of how globalized the world is are also the people who are most likely to agree with notions like complete standardization, ubiquity, statelessness, all kinds of things that actually turn out to be quite counterproductive when you're really developing a global strategy.
In the book, you talk about several different types of players in all of this who can help to make integration better, a positive experience. Who are those players, and what are some of the things that we can do?
Yeah, I think that there are a whole range of different actors that have some influence on what happens in this regard. Governments stand out as the most obvious players. And when governments stoke fear about globalization, which they do tend to do, they're doing themselves and their citizens a great disservice. So in fact, I started writing my World 3.0 book because there was a 6-fold increase in rice prices back in 2007, 2008. And the then French President Sarkozy, in particular, railed against the speculators and said, what we have to do is shut globalization down because, this kind of thing is just the result of too much globalization. So I went back and just looked at some simple numbers. It turns out that less than 5% of world rice production is traded internationally. It's not quite clear that reducing that 5% to 2 to 3% is going to reduce volatility. It seems much more likely to increase it. And so the people who were really cheering when Sarkozy made his comments were the commodity traders I know were saying, oh boy, more volatility, this would be great if we actually did this. So governments have a huge influence, and in some sense, given how important governments are at setting the rules of the playing field, et cetera, at a minimum, try to avoid doing counterproductive things, even if you sense that, domestic popular resistance to things like immigration might not allow you to move in the right direction or make further progress in the desired direction just yet. At least avoid doing things that take us backward, which Sarkozy's statements about, international rice prices strike me as a pretty good example of. Second, businesses, and I've already talked about this, so I won't repeat myself, but businesses that are more sensitive to differences between countries are likely to make more money and also foster more goodwill or less ill will than businesses that don't. The educational sector has a critical role to perform because one of the things that we do find from our quantitative analysis is that global only tends to decline with educational levels, but that's a very rough correlation. Clearly, the content of what that education is probably also matters. And in this regard, this is one of the things that I'm most concerned about because most of the psychologists I know suggest that by the time we get students in for master's programs, it's already a little bit late in the day to be trying to shape their worldviews. So in some sense, we need to be pushing this not just into colleges, but into high schools. And actually, I had my first high school teaching experience just out of curiosity 2 years ago, because I wondered if any of these ideas could be explained to people, seniors in high school, because it seems really, really important to reach people at that level of development if you're trying to affect attitudinal change. I think that journalists have a huge responsibility. There's a tendency in journalism to depict things in black and white,
Right.
and some people are just uncritically for globalization and therefore lack credibility. Some people are uncritically against it and therefore inveigh against the idea that it could yield anything positive. And probably the most disturbing thing to me in that regard that can be quantified is if you actually look, it's not just the shortfalls of our educational system. If you look at the extent of news coverage of international news on US TV, US print media, even online, same thing in the UK, it's actually decreased over the last few decades. So the journalists need to step up as well. And then finally, ultimately, it's hard to imagine good things happening unless at least some individuals take some personal responsibility. So there's this famous hypothesis in social psychology, the all-port contact hypothesis, which is that when people have more contact with people unlike themselves, they're likely to think more favorably of them than if they have no contact whatsoever. And so I think, and this is one of the things that I tell my students, this is what I was telling my students at Stern on the first day of the MBA program, ultimately, others can do only so much to help ease the way for globalization. Some of what has to happen is internal to people and has to be managed by themselves. So ask yourself what you're going to do during your 2 years in the MBA program in one of the world's most, if not the most, globally connected city, not just to explore what's in New York City, but also to take advantage of all the connections that New York City has with the rest of the world in order to reach a little bit farther, think a little bit differently, talk to strangers, doing a range of different things. I had Anthony Appia, who's a philosopher of cosmopolitanism, talk to my undergraduate students at NYU. And Anthony, who's thought very deeply about these issues, when asked this question, stroked his chin and said, well, try and watch at least one film with subtitles every month. Even something like that could make a huge difference.
What does World 3.0 look like? What's the vision?
Well, I think of World 3.0 as not the vision, but the realities. So I was going chronologically. World 1.0 I think of as the extreme view that national borders are so impermeable that we can basically ignore the little bit of stuff that somehow manages to float across them. And that's probably not a good way of thinking about the world today. World 2.0 is the opposite extreme. National borders have faded away to such an extent that we can just ignore them and pretend that the world is one giant country, and this is the world as flat view. World 3.0 is, to me, the sensible middle ground that recognizes that international interactions are neither so negligible that they can entirely be ignored, nor so pervasive that they've managed to overshadow borders and all the other differences that still divide us. World 3.0 is the world we live in which international interactions matter, but border effects are still very, very large. And it's only in this world that a lot of the current policy initiatives that people are talking about, like say the Trans-Pacific Partnership, make sense. Because if the world were already fully integrated, why would we be thinking about doing new trade deals or anything else to change the status quo? And so World 3.0 is, to me, not just a realistic depiction of where we are, but one that leaves open the possibility of some useful action to improve our own situation in a way that neither the extreme of everything is utterly balkanized into individual countries, nor the extreme of we're already one giant country, really suggests useful steps for action to improve things.
This is Sardar TV. I'm Jennifer Crumpton. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.